Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 24th of November 2020. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Thanks very much for spending some of your evening with us tonight. Very important subject, very important indeed, to talk about first-time buyers and what first-time buyers should do. The truth is, it's a complex situation, so many moving parts. And from my analysis and conversations with a number of first-time buyers, there are lots of questions which need answers. And boy, have I got a panel for you tonight to be able to go through that and get some really good answers. And of course, you can ask questions live on the stream. Just before we get started and I bring the panel in, let me just remind you, this isn't financial advice. If you have a specific question, of course, you can ask directly. Just use @WalkTheWorld to make sure that you get my attention. There's always lots of other stuff going on in the chat. That's great. We encourage it, but I don't necessarily everything that's going on. We are moderating the chat room, of course, as normal. No racial slurs, please. And this is as at the 24th of November 2020. So if you're watching this 5 years down the track, you'll know whether we got it right or whether or not. Oh, you know, who knows? And Super Chat's enabled, so if you would like to make sure that your question goes right to the top of the queue, you can use Super Chat. Or if you want to make a donation to help us with what we do, you can do that too. Now, let me introduce my guests for this evening. So I'm going to push a couple of buttons. I'm going to push that one. And I'm going to push that one. Veronica Morgan, are you there?
Woohoo, I am here. Hello, Martin. Nice to be back.
Great to have you back on the show. Long time no see, but so much going on.
So much happening.
Can never say it's boring.
No.
And we've got your colleague Meighan on as well.
We do indeed. Meighan Wells, my partner in crime.
Hi, Meighan.
Can't see Martin, I don't think. Can we see Martin? Sorry, can we see Meighan?
See me yet? No.
Yeah, Veronica, you stop talking, Meighan start talking, and it should switch over.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Magic.
Martin, but that's going to be very hard. If who's on screen depends on who's talking, there's little chance that you'll actually see much of me tonight.
Okay. Well, what I'll try and do is direct questions specifically at you, right, to make sure that... look, I think what it'd be good... Meighan, why don't you give a bit of an introduction to yourself? People will have known Veronica from other things that we've done. You're new to the channel. Great to have you on. So just give us the pen picture, if you would be so kind.
Thanks, Martin. It's great to be here. Yep. Veronica and I have known each other for a number of years, and this is our first business collaboration together. Very exciting. But myself, I'm director and founder of Property Pursuit, which is a specialist Brisbane buyers agency, and we particularly specialise in that greater Brisbane area. I just love what we do. We've helped over 680 people, help them make intelligent decisions, choosing the right home or investment property. And together with Veronica, I'm the co-founder of Home Buyer Academy. And that's a dedicated online course. And the first course, which is your first home buyer guide, is specifically for first home buyers to make sure that they take every step really carefully and methodically. So we're pretty excited about this, actually.
Well, it's so timely, isn't it, given everything that's going on?
Yeah, there's a lot of look. There's lots. You can find lots of information online, and you can find lots of experts who will give you an opinion. But I think that methodical, step by step, making sure that you have the right people on your team and you go through the process properly. You've got to kind of weed out the noise and stop listening to things that might direct you or push you in a direction that isn't going to help you necessarily.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of noise, and separating the sheep from the goats is the critical thing. And talking of sheep and goats, Veronica, do you want to do your introduction?
I'm going to say I'm a goat because... So, look, I'm also a buyer's agent. I'm a principal of Good Deeds Property Buyers in Sydney. And, it's a very small, bespoke business. And I made a decision a long time ago. It's completely not scalable because in order to scale a buyer's agency, you have to commoditize it. And once you commoditize it, you have to help people buy stuff that's not that great. So that's Good Deeds, but so that's limited in terms of how we can help people. But certainly Home Buyer Academy, which is what Meighan and I have been working on building, that, however, is so important because we both passionately believe in helping first home buyers get that firm rung on the ladder, very firmly. But sometimes people who want to buy a property shouldn't. And I think that's a conversation that most people in our field don't want to have with people. And that's something that we're certainly not shy of having. And obviously I'm the co-host of the Elephant in the Room property podcast as well, where we do talk about the elephants in the room.
Well, we've got a whole load of questions and there'll be others on the live stream, but I want to start thinking of this as a life cycle evolution, right? So, first time buyer wakes up one morning and thinks, maybe I should buy a property. Question one is, what are the things you should think about right at the start of the journey of thinking whether in fact you should buy or not?
Well, it's a good question, because the thing is that you've got to think about things in the right order. Otherwise, you can completely stuff it up. The amount of people that actually start their home buyer journey when they actually find a property and then they try to retrofit everything else, race around, trying to get grants, trying to get parents to go guarantor, panic. We've developed this system called the PACE system, which is it's 4 distinct phases, but 10 steps within that. And the first things you've got to be thinking about is, at first, your support crew, where you're going to get advice from through this process, because it shouldn't probably be your parents and your friends. So that's the very first thing that we actually start teaching people, is that you've got to assemble a crew, a very strong crew around you that can actually guide you and help you go in the right direction. And without that, you are, it's so easy to just go AWOL. So that's the first thing. And you have to learn. You have to learn the pitfalls, and you have to learn what mistakes to avoid before you really can confidently move forward and buy a property. And there are, for any property buyer, but particularly first home buyers, so many pitfalls, because unfortunately they're all fuel for the economy, particularly at the moment.
Cannon fodder, as I say. Meighan, what do you think the biggest pitfall is in the early stages?
I think one of the things that we have found people do in the wrong order is get excited about the process of going online, looking at realestate.com, choosing an area or a property type they think they'd like to buy, when they have absolutely no idea what their actual borrowing capacity is. So it's all wonderful to go online and try a few online finance calculators, go to the big majors or a broker. But if you don't do that step of organising your finance, then you could very well put yourself in a position where you're making an offer on a property that you simply cannot afford. So getting that step in the wrong order is probably one of the big mistakes that we see people make.
Right. And one of the questions I've always got is, just because a bank says that you can afford to borrow 6 times income, doesn't necessarily mean that you really can.
I might throw to Veronica.
I'll let Meighan choke. Not too seriously though, please. Look, this is a real dilemma, okay? Because the thing is that, yes, certainly in previous years, banks have been, before, all these tightening up of lending requirements, banks have thrown money at people that, rather generously. And a lot of our clients used to come to us, for instance, and say, the bank will give us this much money, but there's no way in a million years you want to spend. That's crazy. I'd never thought. No, that's just too risky. I won't do that. And then, of course, 2016 came and we started having the opposite come along, and people were used to having easy access to funds, and they'd come along and they'd be like, I can't believe they won't give me that much money. And then it became, how can I get more money out of the bank? So there's these sort of two ways of the bank behaving and then consumers or buyers behaving. But certainly with first home buyers, one of the big problems with not getting their full understanding of their capacity, and that ties in with cash flows and saving and all the stuff that goes along with that. One of the issues is that quite often they can get in the problem of borrowing too much and getting into, all sorts of problems. But that's largely also if they buy the wrong property. And then on the flip side of that, they try to stay under certain thresholds because, the government incentives, or they're trying to avoid lenders' mortgage insurance. But in some circumstances, they actually can buy a better asset if they do stretch themselves further, and a better asset being something that might not lose money. There's a novel idea. Or something that actually might be big enough for them to grow into, and then they don't have to transact that or have to sell it and then upgrade in a short period of time. So there are bigger picture things to consider than just simply being fearful of the amount of money you're borrowing. You could borrow 200,000, and if you buy a terrible property that goes down in value, that is shocking, even though it's only 200,000. You could borrow $1 million and you buy a property that will go up in value if you know what if you know what to look for, and that's vastly less risky than the $200,000 somebody might borrow to buy a crap property. So the whole conversation around how much you borrow and what will be thrown at you by the banks, et cetera, has to be really tackled a bit more holistically.
Right, and I just wonder whether that means doing something which a lot of people find really uncomfortable, but sitting down and actually working out what your money coming in is, what your money going out is, what your cash flow is, what your contingencies are. I mean, all of those horrible mathematical things. I mean, it's interesting. I've surveyed more than 40 first-time buyers as part of this conversation that I've had through the DFA one-on-ones, right? And about half of them have done a lot of work, and about a half of them are just scared to do the work. It's really fascinating watching that change, very different behaviour. And in some cases, they've basically taken on trust what the banks have said, right, in terms of what they can afford, and assume that if the bank says they can actually get that side of mortgage, they've assumed that means they can afford it, right? The other people have done the work, and very often the people who have done the work end up with a smaller mortgage. Which is interesting.
It's really confrontational, isn't it, to actually hold up the mirror and look at your own spending and look at your own capacity and say, I'm wasting an awful lot of money on what was the famous line? Smashed Avo for breakfast. Wasn't it Bernard Salt who famously said that first-time buyers need to stop spending money on smashed Avo for breakfast? But it is a confrontational thing to dive very deep into your own spending habits and analyse, well, how much can I really actually afford? Not just what the bank says I can afford, but how much can I actually really afford and still have a lifestyle that is sufficient to feel like, you're still living in the real world whilst you have this mortgage.
And one of the things I always think about is think about the what if situation too, right? And particularly now, I mean, a lot of people have discovered income shock. Suddenly the income isn't what it thought, right? How many people had just assumed that their income will grow by 3% per annum every year for the next 10 years, right? The chances are most people's incomes are likely to be static in real terms or go backwards in real terms. And that's very different from the early 2000s when, in fact, incomes were growing faster than, inflation significantly. So that's something else that I think people need to think about. And I always say to people is just play the devil's advocate. What if?
It's a good risk management strategy because you have to think about, depending on what life phase you're in, what sort of, whether you're single, maybe just coupled up, perhaps having plans for children in the future. Depending on what life stage you're at, and first-time owners can be in any of those life stages, you need to think about, well, how am I going to manage this if I move into that next life stage? How will we work with just one income if we do have a child? Will this house work for us if we end up procreating and bringing a new one into the world? So I think life phase is a very important part of that question as well when you're looking at risk management, because the last thing you want to be doing is purchasing a property now because you're single, but then having to sell it within a short period of time because you've moved into the next life phase. And the costs of doing that, Veronica and I have looked at that. The in and out costs of turning over too quickly can massively erode any kind of capital gain that you might hope to get in a short period of time.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, there's one question that's coming on the live chat about affordability calculators. What's your view of those calculators? The question said, calculators made me feel like I could afford half of what I actually can. Hard to get a good idea.
The calculators are as good as what you pay for them.
Okay, zero.
Yeah. There's too many extraneous factors that have to come into an assessment of someone's capacity, their borrowing capacity, and it just can't be taken into account when you do a really basic and simplistic online mortgage calculator. That's really a big part of phase one, in the preparation phase. we talk about your support crew, and those are the people around you. And an online calculator is not part of the support crew. What is part of the support crew is finding the right person who can help you. And we recommend that be a mortgage broker, not a bank directly, a mortgage broker who is independent, who can analyse your situation, look at all of the lenders, and give you all of the options that are going to suit you, not going to suit them necessarily, or suit the bank necessarily.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think somebody who's independent enough to be able to actually give good advice is definitely worth talking with. I have to say, not all mortgage brokers, although, are actually trained in the same way. Some do, I think, a really good job. Some don't. So I guess one interesting question that came up in some of the questions from early on: how do you pick a good mortgage broker?
Veronica, over to you.
Look, it's a great question. And one of the things that I would always say to somebody, and it doesn't matter which expert you're trying to engage, and that is, how much time do they spend trying to ask you questions and understand your circumstances and where you want to go? And are they prepared to offer you options, or are they trying to funnel you down one path that seems easy and seems a bit too convenient, et cetera, et cetera? So I think the quality of questions that any advisor asks is paramount. The other thing that, and I 100% agree with you, there are so many brokers out there, it's ridiculous. And so how the hell do you pick a good one? Now, over the years, I've met many, and I tell you what, when we have clients in Good Deeds, and there's certain things that brokers will say that will give me an absolute red flag, and I'm like, straight onto my client, you know what? You need to find another broker. And obviously I can suggest some people, but, I give them some pointers on what they need to ask as well. And part of it as well is the broker that is in a hurry to give you a automated valuation on a property to try to encourage you to make an offer, or steps outside their lane. If they are offering you any advice that's outside of the mortgage, the structuring, which lender is best for you, the types of loans, fixed rates versus variable rates, all of that sort of stuff, offset accounts, if they're stepped outside of their lane and they're trying to give you guidance on the property, if they don't have the relevant qualifications, then, that's a warning sign. And the other massive warning sign is if they're encouraging you to go down to that block of apartments down the road that's nearly finished, should be finished in 6 months, and they know the builder and they know the developer and they're really good and they've got a great reputation. If they're doing that, then run for the hills.
Right, because it must be said that there are certain funds that flow through certain back channels in some situations, right?
Oh my God, I was actually talking
some amazing stories.
Yeah, and in fact, Meighan and I were talking about this only the other day. I was talking to somebody in that space who was saying that they've been offered up to $50,000 per transaction. This is at extreme end. The more typical, $20,000 per transaction, and that is per property, that they have encouraged people, often first home buyers. So it's the investors and the first home buyers that these particularly target. And certainly because there's less investors in the market at the moment, there's a hell of a lot more first home buyers out there, and they really are sitting ducks for these types of brokers. So you have to be very, very careful.
Yes, and one of the things I've noticed quite often is that that people get funneled into particular deals, and when you look closely, it's often newly constructed stuff, and then there are various kickbacks that go on, and suddenly you realise that you may have paid over the odds, but there's money flowed, and you're not getting a balanced view or a totally objective view. But it's really hard when you're in the middle of it to know that, isn't it?
It's extraordinarily hard. Because it's an unregulated industry, unfortunately. And, there's some regulations teetering around the edges. But at the end of the day, there is a lot of property advice given out there by people who really are not qualified to do so. And unfortunately, the unwitting buyer just doesn't realise that it's so dangerous.
Yeah. I used a word on a show with Edwin last night, which I won't use now, but which I shocked a few of my viewers, because I just got so frustrated with all of this rubbish that is out there, right? And I just get frustrated because so many people get misled and distracted. Meighan, what do you think? What is the most critical questions that you should ask when you actually are thinking about engaging with a mortgage broker? You know, where would you start the conversation?
I think you've got to know that they're independent. And this comes back to the crux of what we've just been talking about. And that is, if they are trying to push you in a direction really quickly without understanding or having asked you what...
Sorry, Meighan, can you speak up a bit? You're actually not...
It's gone down, has it?
Yeah, that's better.
She's back.
Interesting. So I've got this new microphone and I've got to get in the right place. Otherwise, it looks like it's in my ear. How's that, Martin? Is that better?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. No, if you're not loud enough, then Veronica steals the show.
How
unlike
unusual.
her, I know.
I'm used to that. And I'm not precious about it. No, I was just saying, so in talking to a mortgage broker, I think and Veronica hit on it really quickly, and that is, they have to be asking you questions. You have to be the one that they are most interested in, not trying to tell you which bank, which deal, which rate, what kind of offset or otherwise. If they're going straight down that path, then there is some sort of ulterior reason that they're pushing you in a particular direction. And of course, if they are particularly interested in a property type or an off-plan or a development, any of these sorts of things would raise a red flag and should raise a red flag with any buyer that there may be some sort of relationship between the mortgage broker and the product that they are trying to, let's call it spruik to the home buyer. So I think the most important thing that you've got to be able to do is have someone who asks and asks and asks questions of you, understands your situation really, really well. Because the thing that we've really found, Martin, and I think one of the reasons that we founded this course is that first home buyers don't know what they don't know. So if you don't know what you don't know what questions to ask. You're actually relying on the people, the support crew, the people around you, to ask the right questions of you to help you arrive at the right decisions. And if you can't find someone who does that, who asks and asks and asks and challenges you to think about the things that you're considering and the decisions that you might be making, then there's probably some sort of ulterior motive that person has. Of course, referrals from people who have dealt with a mortgage broker and had a really good outcome through those dealings, that is a great way to at least start the conversation and perhaps the first place to look at. But I think it's that interpersonal interaction and that deep desire to understand your situation and find a solution that actually suits your situation that I think is a big part of what first homeowners need to do with their mortgage broker.
And how does that fit in with the best interest duties?
In terms of what type of product?
Well, I mean, my understanding is that the idea is that mortgage brokers should be working in the best interests of their clients. You've just been talking about are mortgage brokers not necessarily working in the best interests of their clients. Welcome
to human nature.
Okay.
I think we could say that about every industry, couldn't we? I think we could broadly say it about just about everybody. If the ulterior motive is not that of the best interests of the client, then I think that's you're going to weed that out really quickly. And I think if you know the right questions to ask, how to ask them, how to interpret the information and what to do with it, then you're armed in a much better way to find someone who's actually going to do the right things for you and to work in your best interests. Because different banks and financiers pay different commission rates, and the mortgage broker isn't paid by the home lender. No, they're not paid by the buyer. Yeah, they're paid by the lender. So so in one way that is kind of a little bit of a conflicted model, but understanding also how that mortgage broker is paid, and if they get some brokers are on really big commissions with some of the majors because they put large volumes through those majors. So they might get a higher commission rate if they continue to put volume through a particular financial institution. So asking those sorts of questions about, what are the differences in commissions that you get, and why would you put me with this one when this particular one might have a better product for me? So challenging some of the advice and assumptions and with the right questions, I think is quite helpful for first-time buyers to do.
But a lot of people wouldn't even know the questions to ask. So that's where the network around you. Now, somebody else has asked, in fact, they asked before the show as well, should I use a buyer's agent? Now, of course, there might be some vested interests on the show here. But, let's just
but let's say that we're very open about that.
Yeah. No, exactly right. So there is a role, potentially, for a buyer's agent to assist, even at the first-time buyer level?
Absolutely. And in the course of 17 years, we've worked with numerous first-time buyers. And first-time buyers aren't always entry-level purchasers. They may have worked overseas, come back, unfortunately, but fortunately may have an inheritance. So it's not always entry-level. It could be sort of mid-level. I guess the decision that those first-time buyers make is they'd rather spend the money on managing their risk and ensuring that they get the right property so that their first step on the ladder is the right one. And that may be the full service, the full search, evaluate, negotiate service, or it may be just when they get to a certain point, perhaps they've found a property and they really want someone to come in with that expert eye, assess really deeply and make sure they're paying the right price for it. So there are different parts of a buyer's agent service that actually suit first home buyers really, really well, depending on how much time they've got, but certainly, why would you buy a property without a buyer's agent is, I guess, what I would say. It's such a big risk and a huge amount of money. We use car brokers for fine. Come on, Martin.
I actually, look, my perspective is simply this. When you know that you are in an unequal situation, you need all the help you can get. And sometimes a buyer's agent is precisely what you need. But there are also other occasions where if you did the work yourself, you could actually, go in quite well prepared. So I don't think it's a binary choice, but it should be on the table. I think that's a really important question to explore.
I think, like with brokers, there's good buyer's agents, there's some pretty ordinary buyer's agents, and unfortunately, particularly in New South Wales, the bar that they've had to clear to get into the industry has until very recently been too low. So as we advise when you're looking at talking to brokers and trying to work out which broker will best work with you, we offer exactly the same advice when you're talking with buyer's agents. Find what's the quality of the questions that they're asking you. Do you feel that they've already given you solutions before they've actually properly evaluated and really explored your needs now, your needs in the future? But also, are they prepared to challenge you? Because, sort of really ordinary buyer's agent will take you come along with your brief, I want one of these, and they say, okay, then, and off they go and find you one of those. And, but that was a really shit property. But, sorry, am I allowed to say that? But that's what you told me you wanted. It's like, well, where's the consultation and the value add in that? So I think that there's buyer's agents and buyer's agents, just like there's mortgage brokers and mortgage brokers, and anybody that and obviously a first home buyer that can afford to find one of those high caliber buyer's agents. Of course, I'm putting my hand up to be one of those, and so is Meighan. Anyone that can afford us, for instance, is going to buy better. They are going to buy better, and they're going to buy with their eyes wide open. They're going to buy very well considered, very well advised, and they're going to have a lot more confidence in what they ultimately do. But it's not always the case in every situation. So it's exactly the same as with mortgage brokers. But the big issue really for first home buyers is scrape together their deposit. That's the massive hurdle, particularly if they do 20% in Sydney, it's like 12 years worth of savings or something. Melbourne for 9 years. I mean, it's stupid. It's ridiculous, the amount of time. They don't have the extra cash, generally speaking, to use a buyer's agent. So it's a luxury, unfortunately, that probably our most vulnerable sector of the market doesn't really have the opportunity to take.
Right. No, I think you're
Veronica,
right.
I think I'd just add to that as well. We often talk about sometimes...
Speak up again, Meighan. Speak up.
Yeah, sorry. Just get close to the microphone. We often talk about the fact that not everyone should buy a property. And that's a conversation that should be had with an advisor who doesn't have a vested interest, and a good buyer's agent will have that conversation with someone up front Sometimes it isn't the best strategy, and we certainly found that, you know, with students in the course, that they've discovered very quickly that actually buying a property is not the right thing for them at this point in their life, because there is something that's going to be changing for them in the near future. So sometimes it's saying not the right thing for you. You know, maybe another investment vehicle. Go and talk to a financial planner about another type of investment vehicle. Or rent vesting, and from an individual property point of view, we believe that, and Veronica and I are very much on the same page with each other on this, and that is the properties that you don't buy are more important than the property that you end up buying. So it's the decision on which ones to avoid, which ones to run from really, really quickly, and which ones to look at a little bit more seriously. That's just as important as which one you end up buying.
Well, I was going to ask about the question of renting versus buying. I've had a few questions before the show about, you know, in the current environment where rents are effectively getting cheaper, you know, in many centres, prices in some areas are still looking pretty excessive and going up in areas, but there's also some, you know, questions going ahead in terms of where the price might get to in the future. So what's the rent buy equation? I mean, how do you sort of try and square that circle?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because, and I think, you know, you do suburb specific data. And this is what people need to understand. You can't look at markets in aggregate. You can't look at a Brisbane market and say you should or shouldn't do this. You can't look at a Sydney market and say you should or shouldn't do this. Certainly in the areas that we buy in, rents have been going up. And it's the fascinating COVID, you know, conundrum is how are prices of properties going up and rents going up at the same time? They usually work in opposition to each other. So we've certainly been seeing anywhere from 5 to 20% increase in rents in within the 10-kilometre radius in houses. Now separate houses from units, and that has been because a large number of rental properties have actually left the rental pool as owners have moved back into them. Expats have repatriated, or people have sold to free up some capital and to ease some of the mortgage stress that they might be feeling. So in some places, actually, whilst interest rates are low, rents are going up, and it is actually more affordable on a cash flow basis to perhaps buy than it is to rent.
Well, I think it's interesting because the Brisbane market and Queensland market generally, I think, has a very different characteristic to the New South Wales and Victorian markets. You know, if I look at some of the suburbs in Sydney and Melbourne, rents are still falling. Whereas I look up in Queensland, rents are actually rising. And, you know, you haven't seen the capital appreciation in Queensland over between 2000 and, I don't know, 12 and 18, 19, you know, maybe moving up a little now, whereas in fact 2017 was the peak year in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah, we just didn't have that rush on prices. And I use the analogy of horses. You know, I often think that Sydney and Melbourne, you know, like these amazing geldings who get in there, they race hard, their price growth is phenomenal. They really go for a period of time, then they break down and prices come off. And meanwhile, in the background, Brisbane's just plodding along like a Clydesdale, like it's just steady and consistent and quite unflappable, and we just don't seem to have those ups and downs. And I talk about Brisbane LGA, not Greater Brisbane. I really want to differentiate between those two statistics. But Brisbane is pretty solid when you look at it longitudinally, and certainly through the GFC period, and we didn't have the dips within that 10-kilometre radius in the Brisbane LGA. And I think that's something that people like if they're a little bit risk averse, or they just want a steadiness. And I know it's boring, and sometimes property investment is boring. You've just got to make some really good solid decisions, and then let it take its course. But interestingly, Sunshine Coast has had some really, really strong growth in this last quarter. Statistics, you know, certainly Noosa, very, very strong. And Martin, I think that's because people now realise that they can have really good jobs in Melbourne and Sydney, but actually live, let's face it, Veronica, in the best place in the world. I'm yet to convince you, but I'm sure one day I will. It's too hot up here, Veronica. But you can work in Noosa and commute down to Sydney or Melbourne for those days that you need to, but have a nice lifestyle. And that's what we've seen, a real influx from interstate, and I think that will drive some price growth in the coming 12 months.
Well, I've certainly seen that in my modelling. There's about 4,000 or 5,000 net positive migrants from New South Wales and Victoria going to Queensland, and it's quite consistent. And it looks to me, even though the virus is now a little bit more under control in Victoria, it's still happening. So there's something much more structural than just the virus driving it. Now, next question I think we need to move on to is units versus houses, and off the plan versus old property. Who wants to lead off on that?
Veronica, over to you.
Oh, I was thinking you're in the box seat already there, Meighan. Oh my God.
You love this topic. You love it.
I love this topic. Okay, so off the plan. Well, I think it's anyone who's listened to anything that I've ever said about that will know that I just think it's a terrible, terrible trap for first home buyers to be focusing on buying off the plan. And the reason is, it's not that everybody will do badly. It's just that there's the odds of you losing money, the odds of the building not being of the greatest caliber, the odds of you not being able to predict how well that building will go over time in terms of appeal to other buyers, the lack of scarcity. I mean, the list goes on and on and on for why buyers of any type, whether you're a first home buyer or an investor or a subsequent home buyer, all buyers need to be very, very, very careful and wary of buying off the plan. And where I get the most upset and probably swear the most is because governments, let's face it, we want to generate, more money into the economy. And let's face it, we all love a good economy. I'm conflicted here. I want a good economy, right? The construction industry employs, 1 million people? The property market in this country is the biggest, what's a $7 trillion market. I mean, this whole, the banks, the big four banks dominate our share market. We are so heavily geared towards continuing to build stuff. And given that investors have they just haven't returned to the market, and obviously the yields are way down too, not that we should ever be encouraging people to buy for yield, but the yields are down. Smart investors realise if you buy brand new and you need to go and sell it, then no investor's going to buy it because they don't get the same depreciation. So the investors just aren't as active, and so foreigners aren't buying our apartments. There's the Chinese buyer has evaporated for lots of reasons. And obviously we don't have this population growth through migration at the moment. So who is going to continue to prop up the construction industry and building all these new properties? First home buyers are the only ones left. So you want to know why you've been thrown up to, Western Australia's now $55,000 in a state where these prices have been falling. And in a state where I was interviewed Damien Collins, I don't know if you know Damien Martin. He's a West Australian buyer's agent, property advisor, numerous hats that he wears, a very, very, smart, measured guy. Interviewed him for the podcast. We haven't released it yet. And, he's talking about some of these house and land package areas in outer Perth or eastern outskirts of Perth, where for years you couldn't give a property away. So for a first home buyer to be given $55,000 to buy something like that the minute a new subdivision happens next door to it, nobody wants to buy it. What if you get divorced? And Meighan talked earlier about, what if you get married and have kids and do all that stuff? What if you get divorced? Things are bad enough without having to give away your house or lose everything. You got $55,000 from the government and the mortgage broker might have pocketed 20 grand. You just paying overs for really, really poor quality property. It's a massive trap for first home buyers. So I haven't answered the entire question there, but I have gone on to I've ranted about off the plan. Do you want to hit the house versus units?
Well, let me just make the point. When that $55,000, that's the local and the Fed put together, is $55,000. When that was announced, right? you can actually go and look at what happened to land prices, right? Guess how much they went up by?
Ooh, would it be $55,000?
Funny that, within a week, right? So that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was that existing properties in and around the surrounding area dropped.
Yeah.
Because everybody got sucked into this homeland package thing as, you know, the government's giving us free money, whoopee. I think it's one of the biggest traps there is. And I've said a few times, and I'll say it again, I think first-time buyers are being lined up as cannon fodder.
It's insidious. It actually is insidious because, you know, yes, it's like, here you go and buy this brand new home. You know, no one has sat on that toilet before. You know, but if you have to sell, nobody is going to touch you. And we are going to encourage the next lot of first home buyers not to buy your house off you that you bought in good faith, but to buy in the next suburb. And we're going to give them $55,000, not to buy yours, but to buy that one. And I just think that is insidious. And it unfortunately, I know wishful thinking just takes over, and it's so much of it around property. And I know that they just can't get over. They focus on, so many of them go, but it's money for free from the government, and they can't seem to separate that from the fact that what they have to buy in order to get that money. You know, it's terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, all you can just say to people is just be really careful, you know, and that you got to understand the agenda, which is to support the construction sector, you know, lots and lots of jobs there, try and get people to sort of make renovations and all those things to support the construction sector. So all of this is about supporting the construction sector. It is not about helping people to get into the property market. That's a byproduct, unfortunately. And by the way, the rest of us are paying through our taxes to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
So true. And I think the other thing that we've got to realise is that most first home buyers won't understand.
Meighan, talk a bit louder.
Keep moving this microphone around.
Yay.
I think the thing we've got to unfortunately understand is that most first home buyers won't understand the implications of their decisions until 5 or 10 years down the track, when they go to sell that asset and they realise that it has not done as well as something that if they'd bought established, they would have, you know, had capital appreciation that was far in excess of the benefit of the grant that they had to buy the property in the first place.
Yeah, there's an interesting comments here from Master Singleton. The government is playing Russian roulette with the first home buyers grant right now. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Well, they've been really open about the fact that it is about stimulating the construction industry, and that, I mean, that's it sounds like and feels like a good thing. I know people personally who, my hairdresser said to me, Meighan, I know that you bang on about us not buying brand new and not buying a piece of land in an area where there's a lot more land to be released, but you know, we're going to take this grant and we're going to do it anyway because we want to, and we want to take advantage of it while we can. And, you know, I almost bang my head against the mirror because it's so frustrating. You know, they'll be in a position where they'll have potentially have negative equity in that property for a period of time that can only be made up by the grants that they've actually received. And our big concern is, you know, one of the things that I kind of like that the government has done is the 5% guarantee. But if you choose the wrong asset, you could actually end up with negative equity and be in a position where the bank starts calling for you to put money into the loan if the equity goes back too far. And that's a really dangerous position to be in if you've got a fixed income and you don't have access to additional funds.
And somebody made the point, of course, that these homeland packages are on, if you look at houses, very, very small blocks, so you're very sort of cramped in as well. But what about this issue of houses versus units? What's your thinking there?
I think like everybody else, we've heard it over and over and over again. We talk a lot about scarcity being very important when you're choosing an asset, and where there's a lot of construction of much of the same things, and we're largely talking about 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom investor style stock of units that are largely cookie cutter and easy to reproduce. You know, in Brisbane, we've had an oversupply of that type of property for a long period of time, and there've been a number of projects that have been shelved, but they're still approved and they will come online at some point in time. So the thing that you've got to be incredibly careful of with unit is the supply side of the equation, because if the only people who are buying these units are those who have a government incentive to do so, and that is in this case first home buyers, who's the resale going to be to? And that's a really, it's a long-term thing to think about, but it is such an important thing to think about when you're buying a property, because if you are buying a property to then, either build a portfolio or have some wealth built out of capital growth over time, you have to think about who the future buyer of the property is, because that's where your potential for capital growth comes in. And if it's not, if there's no one to buy that property down the track, what are you going to do? It's going to be a race to the bottom to sell the same kind of property if there's a large amount of those kind of properties for sale at the same time. So it's a really tough one, because the incentives are there to get in and they're affordable, and you can live in an area, you can potentially live in an area that you really like and be paying a mortgage that is less than you would pay in rent. But if it puts you in a position where you can't do anything, you can't get out of that property with enough money to then step up to the next one, it's not a good decision. So your future buyer is such a big decision, or big thing to think about when you're actually choosing the asset to start with. And units don't have a big buyer pool, 2-bedroom units particularly, and 1-bedrooms. We don't see a lot of 1-bedrooms in Brisbane, but I know they're a bigger product in Sydney and Melbourne. So that's a big, long way down the track kind of picture to have in mind. But future buyer is so incredibly important.
Well, the other point to make, of course, is that if you're buying a high-rise, particularly a modern one, you might have structural issues as well. There are a lot with structural issues, which also are impacting values. Opal Towers are a classic example. That's something else to think about too, because the costs of strata and everything else and maintenance and all those things are often more extreme than people actually take account of on day one.
It's a big hit on your back pocket if you end up with additional levies or maintenance that you hadn't anticipated or budgeted for. That can really bring people undone.
So the thing is, I read an article yesterday, maybe even this morning, and it was talking about a bit of an update on Opal Towers and Mascot Towers. Now, of course, Opal Towers started cracking on, is it Christmas Eve 2018? 2018,
yeah.
And all those people had to be evacuated, and of course you've got a developer, a builder, you've got the state government even on the hook for that property. Mascot Towers, by contrast, started sinking into the ground in July, I think 18 months ago roughly. That was 12 years old at the time that it started sinking into the ground, and nobody's on the hook except the individual owners, the owners corporation of that building, and they have a legal obligation to maintain that building. And I think recent costings were somewhere around the tune of $54 million, worth of works. I think there's something like 60 apartments in the building. That means that individual apartment holders are up for a cost that's more than their apartment is probably worth. So this is, and they're not even living there at the moment. They're all still in temporary accommodation. Now that's a horror story. But I tell you what, it makes Mascot Towers residents and owners make Opal Towers look lucky. No one would have believed you would have been lucky to have an Opal Towers apartment, but when you compare it to Mascot Towers, you're lucky. And so obviously these are extremes, but there have been a lot of buildings that have been revealed that have had shocking defects. And the thing is, and this is what hasn't been well understood by a lot of buyers, that in New South Wales, and obviously there's change, right? The David Chandler, the commissioner for building, all the rest of it, there's been a change, there's new legislation, et cetera, going through, and that's all great for future buyers. But what about anybody buying something that's already constructed or currently being constructed? Because that doesn't actually mean that anyone can still buy with confidence. And so you've got situations, and I've seen so many strata reports, and you've got a lack of clarity around the information that you get before you buy into a strata building. Now, I'm not here to say all strata buildings are bad, but you need to read a lot of strata reports before you can start getting a sense of what's a good building, what's a bad building, what's a good strata report. as in what's got all the information you need in it versus one that doesn't have all the information in it that you need. There is so little guidance around, and this is one of the things that we really hammer home and teach in Home Buyer Academy. If you are going to buy an strata building, you need to understand these risks and responsibilities that go with that. But on the positive side of things, you know, strata levies, and you talk about high levies you can get caught out with, if in a well-run building, you get to share the costs of running and managing that building with other people. And it's budgeted, and, you know, the insurance is covered and the maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. You know, a well-run building is very efficient. You know, strata levies aren't necessarily at a cost, because if you own a home and your roof leaks, you have 100% responsibility of fixing that roof. Your windows need replacing, you have to fix them. You need to still budget to insure your building and maintain your building if you own a house. And I think that's what a lot of people forget. They think, oh, it's just expensive having an apartment. So, you know, there are... If you can recognise a good building and you go for scarcity, buy a building that's established, it's got good history, demonstrable history, you can see that it's been well run, it's in an area where there's not lots of apartments, where there's no potential sites there to be oversupplied in the future. A unit in an expensive area where land values are high can be a really good option for people who really can't afford to buy a house in that same area. And I think that, you know, looking at 3 and 4 bedroom units in a bigger metropolis, say as Sydney or Melbourne, in the future, there's going to be a lot more demand for those for families, because they will be priced out, and they already are priced out of houses in many areas. So there's good case for why units can be a very good thing, but they have to be the right stock that's been built in the first place, and they have to be built in the right areas. So and then the due diligence that buyers need to exercise, it has to be rigorous. And I don't think enough buyers realise exactly how much due diligence they need to do.
No, well, we did a show yesterday with Edwin on building inspections and looking at some of the stuff that you often see. And somebody actually Ricky on the live stream said, no, I've got no confidence in the modern stuff, but I'm in a 60-year-old building and it's still standing, right? So some of the older stuff, and I actually sometimes think that buying older may actually make more sense than buying new. Absolutely,
100%. I mean, my preference is that we look at older buildings. My preference, I love Art Deco apartments, you know. Some of these red brick 3-story walk-ups, some are shocking. Some have been owned by investors and retirees for so long, and no one's put any money into the sinking fund. And in fact, I saw an Art Deco building the other day, actually, that I read the report, and we didn't buy it because it just hasn't had the love and attention it should have had. And new owners are going to cop that, you know. So you get to cop the inattention and the lack of interest of past owners. But where you've got these older buildings, yes, they're still standing. And secondly, you've got history. You can actually look at how they've been run in the past, how they've been managed, what's the balance in the capital works fund, all that sort of stuff. They're excellent clues as to what the experience of living there and owning there is going to be like.
Right, very interesting about that. And you know, like so often the case, don't necessarily just look at the shiny wrapper. Look a bit further. Now, the other question that's come through a few times from people is auctions versus private sale. You know, a lot of people are quite scared about auctions because, you know, they think that if they twitch at the wrong time, they might end up with a property, right? What's your thinking there? Veronica, do you want to go first, and then we'll get to Meighan to come in as well?
I've got to plug my book then, don't I? Because look, I just thought Auction Ready. I wrote a book on this. I might even give a discount. Can I give a discount?
Sure.
If you go to getauctionready.com.au and HB, what are you? DFA. 30% off, I'll give you. There you go. Anyway, love auctions. I love auctions mainly because of the psychology of it, right? Not because I think that they're particularly great for buyers, you know, and sometimes they are good for buyers, sometimes they're good for sellers, but understanding auctions, understanding what's going on behind the scenes, what the point of an auction is, the process of auctions, how you're being influenced through the whole auction process, the quoting process. Understanding what's going on is so crucial to avoid making foolish mistakes, because you just, like Meighan said earlier, you just don't know what you don't know. So you're not even going to look for it. And the sorts of things that buyers complain about with agents all the time, and the reasons that they hate auctions, often lead them to do things that really are not in their own best interests. And I'll just give you one quick example before I kick on to Meighan to get into it, because this is but I love this topic. You know, the reason making a pre-auction offer is something that most buyers want to do. They hate competition. They hate the idea that somebody's going to, you know, outbid them and buy their dream home. But if you don't understand how to look for the signs as to whether an auction is going to be competitive or not, because if it's not going to be that competitive and there are signs to look for, then it's better and in a buyer's best interest to go to auction. But if it is going to be competitive, under what circumstances and how do you make a pre-auction offer, and how do you do that in order to minimise your chances of missing out on that property? And this is something that is driven out of fear, that buyers just go, right, I've got to make an offer, without really understanding, once again, what's going on and how to assess it and work out really the best plan of attack. So auctions for buyers can be very good. They can also be shocking, and luck can go both ways as well. You know, luck can go in the vendor's way and it can go on the buyer's way.
Meighan, do you want to add to that?
At the moment in Brisbane, just about every property that we are assessing for clients ends up in a multiple offer situation. And the way that multiple offer situations are dealt with generally, best practice, I guess you'd say, is that buyers are told to put their best and final offer forward with best conditions. Most offers in Queensland that are done under private treaty have conditions on them. You're absolutely blind. You have absolutely no idea what the other parties are offering, what their terms and conditions are. You could be $1,000 above the other person, or you could be $50,000 above the other person. And I dislike that greatly for buyers. I think it's there's nothing unethical about it. It's the best practice methodology for agents to use. But I would much rather be standing on an auction floor, eyeballing the other parties and paying $500 more than them at the end of the day under auction conditions, than having this blind throw your best dart at the dartboard and see if it lands or not. So for me, when the market is like this and there are multiple people who are interested in a property, I would rather take my client to auction every day of the week than do a blind multiple offer. And that's because I can see what everyone else is doing and I can manage that process a lot better because there is a lot more transparency. Now, I know that buyers don't like auctions, and that's because they don't generally understand the psychology behind that process. Why things are done certain ways. There's a lot of script and dialogue that auctioneers use and agents use in the preparation lead up and during the auction itself. But once you understand that and you can use it to your advantage, then you actually are in a much better position to bid confidently at an auction. And as long as you've set your limit in stone and you do not exceed that limit, then if someone else pays more, they'll admit, that's theirs to have. There'll always be another property. Trust me, in 17 years, there has always been another property. Don't pay too much just because you fear that you're going to miss out on a particular property. And there's so many great stories that Veronica and I have shared over the years of people making really dumb decisions in the heat and the emotion of an auction that I can understand why people don't like them. But, if you go in well-educated, Veronica's book's got great tips and tricks and practicalities. And of course, in the course, we go in depth into how to prepare for and bid at an auction and how to have that control under very trying emotional circumstances. So for me, I'd much rather bid at an auction where I can see what everyone else is doing than throw the dart at the dartboard on a private treaty.
That's very interesting. And you've made 2 points, one of which I keep saying, which is there is always more property, right? There will always be more property, right? And the other one is know your limit, stick to it regardless, come hell or high water, because there is psychology. And of course, some people react, badly, some less badly, but you can get sucked up in the moment and then live to regret it later, right? So that's why the limit's critical.
I've seen it time and time again, and there's an absolute classic example in Brisbane, and it is talked about almost like it's some sort of, fable that no one can believe actually happened. And there was a property in a very well-regarded suburb, and comparable sales data would indicate it would be around 1.1. We didn't actually have a buyer there for that particular property, but we watched the auction, as did a crowd of about 50 or 60 people. And there are two things that buyers can fall into that can really take them away from logic, and that is if they become really emotional during the auction process, or if an ego overtakes and that fear of loss or that need to win takes over, and this crowd of 50 people, whatever it was, watched almost a ping pong match of these two buyers. There was the husband with the wife and the daughter. The wife and the daughter were crying, and you have to keep going, and we can't lose this property. So the emotional impact on them was quite huge. And then on the other side was someone who just quite simply was not going to not buy this property, and it went for over 1.4 million. So that there were only two people that took that property from 1.1 to over 1.4, and it was those two emotional drivers of ego and fear of loss, essentially. Now the guy that got it was the one that was not going to miss it, and he was not going to miss it under any circumstances. Was he ever going to walk away from that property without owning it? But it was a classic education in why people probably shouldn't bid at auction for themselves. They should actually get someone who's unemotional and unattached to not exceed the limit, because dead set, both those people were well over their limits.
The issue is how you set the limit, though. And quite often people, and I love going to auction and watching people when I'm not bidding, right? And I watch people go over the limit. I watch them give the signs away that they've gone over the limit, because they all do. And even the strongest bidders, watch them and think, wow, they've been coached, they've been practicing this. And then they'll get to the limit and you'll see it and it'll be really clear. And I don't mean like when I get to my limit, no, I'm out. I'm actually out. There's freedom into the fan, it's basically as running full pelt to the cliff, right? You can't give it away. And so what happens though? They give it away and then they continue bidding. And so then they've gone over the limit, and everyone else knows they've gone over the limit. So everyone else thinks, oh, great, I've got an opportunity here. So when you watch a number of buyers doing that, you think they didn't pressure test their limit. So they went in with what they wanted to buy, what they hoped they could buy the property for, not what they would if they had to absolutely under pressure go to. And this is the difference. And this is, I know Meighan has this sort of type of conversation with her clients. I certainly have that with ours. We teach the students in Home Buyer Academy also the process you go through, because there are 4 pillars that you need to consider before setting your limit. And if you don't set it high enough, you're going to keep missing out. And then there's this wishful thinking idea, and some people don't keep bidding over their limit and they stop at their limit, but their limit was wrong, because they never set their limit enough to actually buy a property. They're thinking, oh, I can't pay that, even though it's worth it. If they had done their research and compared it to other properties, they could justify it. But there's this idea of, oh, I can't pay that. Well, if you keep going to auctions with that attitude, you're going to keep missing out. And what buyers will do, I've seen it time and time again, you'll see the sort of buyer that gives up in the end and they don't buy anything. Well, they wait for the market to go down, and it might have climbed a bit more before it goes down. So, they may be ahead, but they may actually be further behind. Or they'll say, it doesn't matter, I've just got to be the highest bidder because clearly that's the only way I'm going to buy a property. Then they throw out any idea of having a limit and they just go to their capacity. And that's what they set as their limit, not actually what is this individual property worth and what is it worth to me and how scarce is it and should I push myself for this or should I not? And these sorts of questions that people don't ask themselves enough in a measured way so that they can actually proxy the emotion before the auction, not in the middle of it, and then consider all this stuff for the first time when they're under pressure.
Yeah. The last thing you want to be doing is making it up on the fly as you go, right?
That they do.
You need a plan. You need a clear strategy, and once you've seen it a few times, you can begin to unpick it. But if you're doing it first time buyer, first auction, you're going to be up against people who've done it many, many times, and you'll be at a disadvantage.
I've seen people actually bid for themselves at the first auction they've ever been to. So it's not even like they've observed, and this is the first time they've bid. This is actually the first auction. I'm shocked. I love chatting to people after auctions. It's like, I'm gobsmacked at the cavalier attitude that Australians have towards buying property.
Well, it's the old she'll be right attitude, isn't it? I mean, you see it in all sorts of walks of life, including auctions. Okay, so we've sort of gone through the process from thinking about property, what type of property, what can I afford, the finances, the process of buying, what am I going to buy. Once you've actually got to the point where you're there and the contract is either locked in or it's about to get locked in, there are a set of procedural issues that people should also think about too. And I'm thinking of things like building reports. I'm thinking of things like suburb reports, looking at, what development down the road is going to happen, all those sorts of things. My observation is quite often that gets overlooked as well.
Couldn't agree more.
I know I like to talk a lot. I'll let Meighan get into this one because the one thing that Meighan has always said to me, it's buyer beware in Queensland. And I'm like, it's buyer beware everywhere. Come on. There's not enough information that is disclosed to buyers, certainly not in New South Wales. And she said, no, it's worse in Queensland. And I have to say, it is. And so I'm going to hand it over to you.
It does Meighan, your head in, doesn't it?
Look, to be honest, buyers in New South Wales don't do enough due diligence. They don't even know what to do. And yet the level of disclosure for vendors, a compulsory disclosure of vendors requirement is a lot higher here than it is in Queensland. I'm still gobsmacked by how little is offered to the buyer before they commit in Queensland.
And I think that comes to the crux of the point, and that is that every state is different. So even if you've purchased a property in another state, if you then go to purchase in a new state, you've kind of got to throw out what you know and start from scratch again, because what you think if you've bought a property in New South Wales is going to be vastly different to what you need to know if you're going to buy a property in Queensland. It's so important that people understand how big the differences actually are. And if we look at that, the process itself, most of the time in talking to Veronica, most of the time offers are made in New South Wales that are unconditional. So in terms of process, you're doing those types of things, Martin, that you mentioned, like building and pest inspections, strata reports, all of those sorts of things actually have to happen before the contract is exchanged between the parties. So if you get that around the wrong way, you may well end up with an unconditional contract on a property that you haven't done the right due diligence on. Whereas in Queensland and Victoria and there are a number of other states, private treaty negotiations are around the other way. So you might make an offer, a contractual or on contract, an offer to purchase a property, but it will be subject to a number of conditions. And the most common ones are subject to finance approval. So the bank will value the property, make sure what you've paid for it is actually what it's worth. Maybe subject to building and pest inspection. We also look at pool inspections and electrical inspections and plumbing inspections, things that really delve deeply into the state of the property and any issues, any costs that might come up. And largely we're talking houses here in Queensland rather than apartments. But other things that are really important that people don't necessarily think about might be things like renovations that have been done to the property. There is no requirement for the seller to provide any information as to whether those renovations or extensions have been certified or approved. And if you don't understand whether they have or haven't been, and you buy a property, council can actually issue a show cause notice and tell you to rip it down if it hasn't been certified or you can't get it retrospectively certified. So you may well pay for, let's say, a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with a deck, and suddenly find out the deck's got to be ripped off and downstairs actually isn't approved. So doing that due diligence in the right order and having the right conditions on the contract is really different. Going to throw to you, Veronica.
Well, Meighan clears her throat. And this is the interesting thing. Okay, so in Queensland, you sort of, when you make a conditional offer, you've still got to know what conditions to put on that. Because if you don't know what's missing, you don't know what things that you need to have investigated, you're not going to make the offer conditional on those things. And if you discover those things after you've actually signed a dotted line, then you don't have any recourse. So, and in New South Wales, actually the same sort of deal with building approvals. You can still buy a property that's been renovated and hasn't actually been approved in New South Wales. That's not necessary to be disclosed either. You will have things in a contract that sort of will be ask covering clauses, for the vendor to not disclose. And depending on how hot the market is, will be how much tolerance buyers have for that. And so, when the market's very much a buyer's market, well, then the buyer can cross their arms and sit back and say, well, no, I'm not buying it without that occupation certificate, or I'm not buying it without that homeowner's warranty certificate, et cetera, et cetera. But when it's hot like it is now in houses, that buyers will, okay, I don't care. I just want to buy. I'm in, FOMO, I'm frenzy. So, but I tell you what, if they find they have to remove an extension that they think is approved, they're going to be in a lot of pain. So this whole push to reduce the pain or relieve the pain of missing out right now versus the medium, could be even short-term pain of buying something that has some serious problems. People need to, big part of what we teach in the course is slow down, and it's sort of half the way through, it's revise and correct. Slow down before you buy something. Make sure that you're making a very, very wise decision.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I'll tell you a little story. The place we're in now, we went and looked at the local council and looked at the plans that were approved. And the plans that were approved were completely different to the property that was actually built.
And what did you do?
Well, we sort of asked a few questions and got to the bottom of it. But it's really interesting when you think that, well, hang on a moment, they approved X and you got Y.
And this is the thing too, because it's while one of the, step one in the pay system is getting your support crew, and that includes getting a good lawyer. And we talk about using an experienced conveyancer or a property lawyer. And, there's a story I've told this many, many times about when we're buying a property actually on the show. So on location, up in Byron Bay, looking at a villa unit up there, and Farmer Dave was the guy and had this deck and a garden that was advertised as with this courtyard, right? It's a walled courtyard with a shower, so you can come in after you surf and have a shower, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, great. So the lawyer says to Farmer Dave, all right, so there's a deck on here. There's a deck. He says, yeah. And that was sort of it. And then when I looked at the contract and then compared it to what I saw, there was an exclusive use rights for this deck. So it wasn't actually on title. And I was like, yep, the deck's is allowable, of course. That's been approved, but not the garden, not the shower, not the fence. And the person before Farmer Dave didn't actually ultimately buy this particular property, but when we pointed it out to them, the person who owned it didn't know when she bought it. She bought it as is. No one questions to the degree. And so I can imagine the lawyer saying, oh, it's renovated. Yeah, it's renovated. Oh, good. There's been approved plans. That's great. Never actually putting the two side by side and go, oh, but that wasn't what was approved. It's the same thing. It's very, very easy mistake to make. And if you don't have really good, you don't do your own due diligence, or if you don't actually have good people in your support crew who understand the right questions to ask and the nuances, you can easily buy something that will not get what you think you're buying.
Well, another example, when I bought some years ago up in Sydney, we discovered that the main drain from the house was actually owned as an easement and went through somebody else's property to the drain, right? And when we actually spoke to the lawyer, it was actually an unofficial easement.
An unofficial easement?
Yes.
So it was unregistered?
Exactly. Yeah. Which basically meant that at any point somebody could come and say, excuse me, we're not going to let you use that drain anymore. So we actually negotiated to drop the price of the property sufficient to be able to put a direct drain to the sewer. I mean, those are things that you would not imagine, but it's a good example of things to watch out, right? Because you can get caught so easily.
Yeah, and then they're not often searches that are routinely conducted by the solicitors, there are a number of searches that you have to ask for that aren't just the common sort of ones. And if you haven't got the right clauses on a conditional contract, it doesn't matter what shows up in those sort of searches. You probably haven't got a remedy or any termination rights. So getting the offer conditions right so that you actually can do those sorts of searches during the conditional period is really quite important. And there's nothing that replaces a solicitor's advice pre making a contract or making an offer, or getting the contract right before you actually make the offer.
Right, and let me just make a point here. There is a big difference between a conveyancer and a solicitor, right? One is basically just doing the paperwork. The other is actually hopefully applying a little bit more science and thought to the transaction. And the number of times I've heard people say, well, I've cut corners by doing some of it myself and I got a conveyancer to do the other bits, right? And I just wonder to what extent people actually end up digging themselves a deep hole because of it.
Can I clarify something there? Absolutely. I think what you're talking about there is the cut price conveyances, is the not all you can eat for $9.90, sort of thing. There are excellent conveyancers out there that absolutely charge the same as a lawyer would, as experienced and specialists in their area. So I think I just wanted to draw that distinction, because I tell you what, there are some solicitors out there that are your local generalists. They know less about property than, I don't know, the guy selling petrol at the petrol station. I mean, they just because they study contract law at university doesn't actually mean they know anything about property. So when you're looking at a lawyer, you need to look at an accredited property specialist. That's what they call in New South Wales anyway, but somebody that predominantly does residential property, because you can, cut price conveyancers. Totally agree with you. Just give them the wide berth and don't try and do it yourself, because you can, but so much you can lose.
If you make a mistake and it goes wrong, it goes horribly wrong. Somebody's just asked, I don't know whether you know this, are solicitors meant to pick up rezoning plans before advising contracts property are okay? Interesting question. I always make sure that my solicitor does do those searches. I'm not sure whether they would do it without being asked.
I actually don't know, to be honest, the exact searches that a solicitor does after exchange of contracts in New South Wales. I do know that I'm not sure if he's talking about rezoning of that property or neighbouring property. There is a zoning certificate, which is actually an essential document in a contract of sale in New South Wales. One of those things is not compulsory in Queensland, and in Victoria there's a section 32, which is a compulsory document. The vendor disclosure statement is called, and a zoning document, to my knowledge, needs to be part of that as well. And that's a really good thing to read, particularly if you don't know an area and you want to understand what's coming. That's a really good document to read, and you need to also understand what's coming in the local development control plans and those sorts of things. But
it really comes back to the buyer. It's not really the solicitor's job to understand what the zoning is and what might be happening around it. It's up to the buyer to do those investigations as part of their due diligence prior to making any sort of commitment to the property. And that information is all freely available online. In Brisbane, the Brisbane City Council city plan is an interactive mapping system, and you can look at everything, zoning, whether there's any character controls over the houses, what date, whether that house can or can't be demolished, flooding, overland flow, creek. All of those things are freely available. You have to know where to look and how to get that information, how to interpret it, and what it actually means to the property, and whether it means you should or shouldn't purchase the property. So that's a massive part. That is an absolute massive part of what a buyer should be doing when they're investigating a property, even before having a chat to a lawyer about a contract.
Absolutely.
In fact, Meighan does a great little video on, as part of the Home Buyer Academy, the Your First Home Buyer Guide, does a great little video and taking buyers through the Brisbane City Council website. It's just amazing what you can get in these websites.
Huge amount of information.
It's knowing what to look for. So you sort of go through layer by layer by layer, but it is all there.
Yep, but you have to know to ask the questions, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
That's the whole point, and that's in a way what this show is about, which is to say there are some questions which you should be asking through the process. Now let's just go through to the end of the process. So you settled, got the property, you get the keys. But actually, that's not the end of the process. This is the start of the process.
We've actually
welcome to home ownership. Woohoo!
We've actually skipped a massive part of it. You know, we actually in this conversation, Martin, we've skipped the whole searching and inspecting actual property and working out where to buy in the first place, which is one of the biggest questions that first home buyers ask. They're certainly one of the biggest questions they ask us. In fact, I'm going to put a shameless plug here if I can.
Go for it.
Because this Saturday afternoon, we're actually running a Where to Buy workshop with Home Buyer Academy. If you want to join us, it's homebuyeracademy.com.au/workshop. It's $99. The process that you need to learn to go through to work out where to buy is the important thing. And this is what we teach, is the process, so you can work it out. There's no magical bullet. There's no top 10 suburb list. That's it. You can't go to hotspots. You can't, so the process and to go through to work out what the most important things are and what you can compromise on, because you're going to have to. It's the ugly C word, but basically that process is really, really valuable, because you got to know where to look so that you can know what to look for. And now I'm handing over to you, Meighan, to talk about searching and inspecting.
With you. But that's the thing, isn't it? Everyone wants the magic bullet, the silver bullet, the answer to the question, which is the next hotspot? Where should I buy? How am I going to make the most amount of money in the shortest period of time? And by the way, I want a bargain. And all of those things just don't go together. They're incongruent. They're things that the answer to that question is so unique to each individual that if anyone was to say to you, well, you should be buying in Concord because, there's a lot of infrastructure improvements going on there, and by the way, it's really close to the airport. Run a mile. That is such poor advice when they don't understand your situation. They don't know what your budget is or what price you're able to pay. They don't know what your lifestyle, life phase is, where you're going in the near future and the long term. So the question around where to buy, there are three key components to that, and that's position, property and price. And there will be compromises in each of those three areas depending on what's fixed and what can be adjusted or changed. And working through a systematic process of understanding your own compromises and arriving at the suburbs that are going to meet your needs in terms of property and price. It's a really empowering process to go through, and coming out the other side gives you such a head start against everybody else when it comes to actually doing the searching itself. So you've got to do that before you start searching. Otherwise, you're wasting a heck of a lot of time, yours and the agents that you're going to annoy.
Agents annoyed? I can't imagine that. That seems such a very strange thing. But no, the whole concept of going through a methodical process and trying to figure out, where to look, what to look for, all those sorts of things. Now, there are a bunch of online tools, but I'd be interested to get your perspective, because my own perspective is they're helpful, but they don't necessarily give you all the information that you need. So, for example, I think some of the pricing information on some of the portals is a bit deceptive, to put it politely.
You've hit on a really big one for us. The automated valuations that you can find online, or property reports, they've got all sorts of different names. There are algorithms that sit behind that attempt to use comparable sales to arrive at a range that a property might be worth. Now, Veronica and I created a free mini course as part of Home Buyer Academy, and we assessed, and it is in essence how to price a property, so how to work out what to pay for a property. And we analysed 10 auto valuations or property reports from different companies, from financiers and so forth. So 10 different ones on a single property. And the property itself sold for $740,000. But the range of the automated valuations was $299,000. So in terms of the reliability or the validity of the information that's provided in those reports, 2 of the reports didn't have the actual sale price in their range. So you would have paid well over what the property was worth if you relied on one of those reports. It just simply was well above the actual sale price. And a few of them were so broad that you could have either, really offended the owner with a ridiculously low offer, or been so far above that they were, high-fiving, clapping, cheering and saying, thank God that this person came out of nowhere. We call them wood ducks in property. So if someone pays an extraordinarily high price, they're often referred to as a wood duck because, there's not many of those around, and it's just quite amazing when they come out to play. So the free information that's online, there's some information in there that could be helpful, like the actual sale price of properties that might be comparable. That's really important information to gather and have within your arsenal, particularly when you're negotiating. But in terms of using that information to arrive at a price or an offer, no, you've got to do that. You've got to do the hard yards yourself. You either engage somebody to evaluate the property on your behalf, or you put the effort in and you arrive at that figure based on your analysis and the information that you've done based on comparable sales.
And I'll just make the point that in certain states you can get sold property data direct from the registry. Now, I know you can in New South Wales and you can in Victoria. I'm not sure about Queensland. It looks to me as though it's harder to get in Queensland. Is that true?
Oh, look, you can get it from a variety of sources. The sold tab on realestate.com, most people don't know that you'll find some sales information there. But you can get the free reports. Use the data, but not the actual proposed price range to guide you.
So the imputed, it should sell between these numbers is the point you're talking about, right?
Ignore at your peril. No, sorry.
big fat texter. And don't even look at it. Just cross it out because you'll be swayed.
Don't look at the outcome. Yeah.
But another risk of relying on the comparable sales in those reports, though, and I've seen some. I saw one mortgage broker franchise was giving them out, and I got some samples from them, and they only had 4 comps in there. And in one of them, not one of them was in the same suburb. So you've got to apply your critical thinking to those comparables. And in some of those reports, they can be very, very good, and they are exactly the right comparables. And so you need to then look at those properties. And if you've been doing your homework, you should have been out there, you've probably seen half of them. If you've actually been doing the hard yards and getting out there and really understanding the local market, which you need to do, you may well have seen them yourself and be building up that arsenal of knowledge. But that information is out there, one way or the other. You can get access to sold data. And we'll add in that certainly is something in Sydney a lot at the moment, price not disclosed. And so this does drive a lot of buyers nuts. It's like, so undisclosed. You ring the agents, and 9 times out of the 10, or even just text them, they'll respond with the price.
Unless it's significantly below. I found in my experience that there are cases where they are very coy about what the price was, and it tends to be on the lower side of the asking price.
Yes. And I've heard of only one though, where the wrong price was given. So generally speaking, we get the right price.
Okay, well, now we're close to the end of the show, but there are just a few quick things to kick over before we finish. Superannuation, right? Should superannuation be allowed to be used as a deposit? Discuss.
Actually, we've had some students that have used that Super Saver scheme. Look, I think if you understand how it works and the pros and cons and the risks associated with it, and you're very, very strict and structured in how you save, it can turn out to be a tax-effective way to save part of your deposit. But going into that with half the information that you need will probably put you in a really difficult place, and you'll either end up not being able to use the money within the timeframes that you're allotted, or using it incorrectly and making a decision on the wrong property because you feel like you have to meet a certain time frame in order to reap the benefits of it.
That's and so obviously that's the Super Saver. Now, of course, on the table again is the idea that first home buyers should better tap into their superannuation savings over and above the Super Saver scheme, just their normal super, in order to be able to buy a deposit, to pay a deposit. The problem with that is that unless the first home buyer is sufficiently educated to be able to make a really good investment decision around that property that they buy, then there's no guarantee that they are going to be better off at retirement by owning their own home or by having used their super to buy it. Because, of course, there's all these arguments around, they should be able to do it because the benefits of home ownership outweigh the benefits of compounding that small amount of money over, 40 years until they retire. That assumes that all property goes up in value, and it assumes a hell of a lot of things. So I think that the level of property literacy in this country is not sufficiently high, and nor is financial literacy sufficiently high, that people in that position are going to be well enough equipped to make these really good decisions for their own best interests. That's sort of where I'm at with it.
I think it's nuts. It shouldn't be allowed. Superannuation is a long-term saving scheme for retirement. You should not put all your eggs, even more eggs, into the property basket. I just think it's crazy, crazy, crazy. And by the way, a number of people in my surveys pulled their superannuation out, because they could get last year and this year, and they've put it in to make a deposit on a property, and banks are lending against it. It's a nutty situation. I think
Yeah, because I'd been hearing that the banks were looking at, did you have true cause to withdraw that money? And if you didn't, then they weren't going to lend the money. So you're saying that that's no longer the case?
Some banks are, some banks aren't. There are a number of banks who aren't asking too hard, shall I say. Yeah, so it could end up as a bit of a tricky situation down the track. So, I just think that we've got the situation. You made the point earlier on about, governments encouraging people to go borrow to support the construction sector. This is another example of keeping prices up magically, artificially, but at the expense of superannuation, which is meant to be a long-term savings scheme for retirement. And by the way, there is absolutely no guarantee that prices are going to do what they did over the last 30 years, because interest rates came down dramatically, lending standards were cut dramatically, financial systems were deregulated dramatically, the amount of debt in the system was relatively low, and now it's very high. It's not going to do the same again over the next 30 years, I should say property does not double every 7 years.
Well, very small percentage might, and depending on what 7 years you're talking about. But the thing is that if these buyers take the money out of super, there's their 20 grand, then they add that to the 55, up to 55, depending on what state you're in, with all the other grants are compounded on top of each other. You got $75,000 to go and buy a property that might be worth 100 grand less than you pay for it next year, maybe.
Yep, exactly.
There are properties that are falling in value between exchange of contracts and settlement, and we're talking blocks of land, we're talking apartments. They're particularly off the plan, but certainly, because of that long lag time period, and God knows what anything can happen. COVID can happen, unemployment can happen, a baby could happen. So many things can happen in a long lead up, between when you actually sign a contract on a property that's off the plan, but even a house and land package, there's a period of time, the big lag, and stuff happens. But you don't have to scratch the surface too far to actually find real life examples of people that have lost money between signing a contract and settling, and having that horrible situation where they had to find extra money in order to settle, and knowing on day one that they have just settled on a property that's cost them more money than they could sell it to somebody else tomorrow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Otto has just made an interesting point. The theme tonight is do your own thinking and your own homework. It's a truism, especially in investing, that by following the crowd, you do no better than the crowd. I think that's a good summary, really. So as we come to the end of the show, any last thoughts? Meighan, what's the one thing that you would want to say to a prospective first-time buyer today?
Take it slowly. Don't feel the great pressure or the fear of missing out on an incentive or a grant. just to get yourself on the ladder, because you might actually find that bottom rung that you step onto is really shaky. And if you fall through the first rung and you don't get that steadiness with the first property that you purchase, then everything that you do from then is from a position of weakness. So don't feel pressure or fear of missing out on a grant. Make sure that it's about the right property, and have a very methodical way of stepping through the process and do everything in the right order. Everything that you need to know about buying a property is available online, but it's actually getting the order right and making sure that you're systematically and methodically moving through each of those steps in the right order. I can't tell you how much that will put you in such a better position as a home buyer to either make the decision that yes, this is for you, and yes, this particular property is the right one for you, or in fact, no, this is not the right property and I should continue my process until I find one that is the right one. I'm not talking about, what colour the kitchen is or how good the soft closed toilet is or how well it's presented. I'm talking about fundamentals, and fundamentals that actually are right for you and your life stage. So I can't force that down everyone's throat more strongly than to say, don't make decisions on buying property based on incentives that are available for a short period of time, because you will find that there is an uplift in prices during that period in the type of properties that people are buying, and that will settle back down again. But if you look at the right fundamentals of a property, and investment fundamentals are important even if you're buying a home, so getting those right, that's my take home. Absolutely.
Great, that's a good advice. Veronica.
Oh, how can I possibly add to that? I think
you will.
Of course I will. Cheeky. Look, for me, the benefits of home ownership are amazing, but, and there's a huge but, the risks of getting it wrong are easier than the chances of you getting it right. And so that's why you need to have a process, and you need to educate yourself, and you need to not take it lightly and just hope for the best. It is absolutely the worst possible thing you can do because of how easy it is to get it wrong. But if you get it right, oh my God, it is worth it. It is worth the sacrifice, and your financial future can be set. It's about getting that first one right and not falling for these mistakes, and not making a mistake through ignorance purely because you don't know what you don't know. There's no excuse now because we've created Home Buyer Academy. There's no excuse. But so it's something that, we talk about the negatives because they are very, very real. And the pain that people go through when they make these mistakes is awful. It's heartbreaking. But we remain positive and enthusiastic about encouraging people to do it right and get it in the right order. And if it's right for you to move forward with confidence, because we know that long term the benefits are absolutely there for when you make good decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky, and it's interesting. I was looking at Shilly Invest. Thank you for that contribution. I've been following your advice and avoided buying property so far. I'm having doubts now, though. Would there ever be a right time to buy property? And I think the point is there is always a property to buy, and there might always be a right time, because it's hard to pick the top and the bottom of the markets. But you've got to do the work, right? And what we've been talking about is the work to be done. And that's true whenever you buy, wherever you are in the cycle, rather than actually trying to pick the top, pick the bottom, in my view at least.
Can I just add to that,
yeah.
Martin? Because trying to pick the bottom or the top of the market is absolute folly.
Yep.
But the reality is that if you aren't and Meighan talked about the fundamentals, if you are not buying a quality asset, it doesn't matter when you buy it. It doesn't really matter what you pay for it either. That's
a dog is a dog is a dog.
Dog is a dog is a dog. You buy a cracker asset, you buy it at the top of the market, and even if you pay a little bit more than you really should have for it, and you hold that long term because it's the right asset and it's the right thing for you to buy, and you hold that long term, that overpayment and that sort of slightly wrong time of the market in terms of the peak of the market, that will get smoothed out and disappeared in the fullness of time. But you buy a dog and you buy it at the bottom and you get it for a bargain, over the fullness of time, that thing is going to underperform and it's still going to stink like a dog, right? That needs a good wash. But anyway, the washing is to get it out of your portfolio. But that's really stretching the metaphor a bit too far. But the timing is less important than what you buy. So therefore, if you're ready to buy a property and it's the right thing for you, then getting the process right, getting the property right is what's more important.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we in Australia are not very good at following due process. In my experience, having come here, many years ago now, and seeing in the UK, I was always accused of being a bit sort of, a bit liberal. And I've come down here to Australia, and I think, wow, there's no process.
You were accused of being a bit liberal.
Yes, I was. Remarkably.
Wow.
I know. Well, look, I just want to say to both of you, both Veronica and Meighan, I thank you very much for your time tonight. I think you've shared a lot of really, really insightful information, and hopefully this particular post will be one that people come back to, because I think there's plenty of learnings to be had there. We'll put links to the various resources that you've mentioned, because I think there's some really useful stuff there. We had a couple of people, Nefi, saying, keep it up, we're doing that. Thanks for your contribution. And Slider 2021, thanks Martin and co-host for your time tonight. There's a few other people also appreciative in the comments too. This has been a really, really important show. And the message I think to take away is there's stuff to be done, but don't assume that, you can never buy. Don't assume that. Do the work.
That's it.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thanks for all the questions.
Thanks for having us.
It's good. Meighan, thank you very much. Good to meet you, and hope you'll come back and spend some time on the show down the track.
Sounds wonderful.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to take you offline for a second while I just finish the end of the show. So thank you very much for everybody spending time tonight. Just to let you know that next week I'll be updating the scenarios and household stress data. There are going to be some big changes in the data based on what I'm seeing, so that'll be an interesting one. I'll also have I'll have the postcode engine there as well, so you can ask me questions about particular postcodes and all of those things. And just to remind people that if you want specific information about a postcode and you want to have a conversation with me, I do offer that service. It's the DFA one-to-one service. You can get that information off the DFA blog. Links are below. I'm booking about 2 or 3 weeks ahead at the moment. Plenty of people still want that detailed information about a postcode from all the different dimensions that we've been discussing tonight. Can help to sort of take the conversation forward. So that's just another reminder there. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Meighan. Thank you for Veronica. And we're going to sign off now, and we'll see you again next week. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off.